You're listening to the Talent Therapy Podcast. Here, you'll find discussions around recruiting trends and best practices with talent acquisition leaders in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries so that you and your team are informed and up to date in an ever-evolving space. And now, here's your host, Chris Tamburini.
Hello, everybody. This is Chris Tamburini with the Talent Therapy Podcast. Today, we have our guest, Wendy Durkin, who brings well over 2 decades of talent acquisition and recruiting experience, both from the agency side and from the corporate side. And I'll let Wendy Durkin introduce herself.
Thanks, Chris. Good to have this conversation. I feel like you and I have known each other for quite some time and have these discussions on a regular basis. So fun to engage again. So as you said, I spent time on the agency side. Originally studied chemistry in college and then found my way into recruiting and ultimately talent acquisition inside biotech companies.
Fantastic. So you actually started off as a scientist or a chemist, and then you found your way into recruiting, right?
Yes. So I studied chemistry in college and spent some time working at the bench and realized that wasn't really my passion. I did enjoy knowing what was going on in the biopharmaceutical industry and just seeing how drugs get developed, but really didn't love working at the bench. So a friend of mine was working for an agency and suggested coming into interview and talk to the science division about an opportunity, and I guess the rest is history. I loved talking to candidates and clients and being able to see all the innovation that was going on in the biotech space. When I first got into this, it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and biotech was really just emerging, at least in the Boston market. So to be able to have those conversations with candidates and clients around the talent they were looking for, I just found my passion. I loved connecting with people and sort of using my skill set and my science underpinning in a completely different way.
Yeah, you and I have had this conversation before, and I can actually relate to that. I have a very similar story where I had a science degree. I worked in a laboratory and decided it wasn't for me. I need to be interacting with people. So it is interesting. I think it's a rare path for people in biotech recruiting, but it, as both of us are proof, it certainly exists. So that is interesting, and it's a good story. So you've been in recruiting we've talked about since the early 2000s. And a lot of people, as you probably know, Wendy, they enter the recruiting field, they try it out for a couple of years, and then they realize, oh, this is hard, this is challenging, there's a ton of rejection, I just don't like the hustle and bustle of it. What keeps you in recruiting? Because you've spent your entire career there, and you've had obviously a successful career there. So what kind of keeps the engine going for you?
Yeah, I think I can relate and understand that it's challenging for people who are new getting into it, because it's really difficult to build up a network of people to reach out to, and you sort of have the pressure, especially if you're in a commission-based environment, you have the pressure of filling positions. But I think if you take a step back and I think about what keeps me in this field, it's really about like the relationship building and helping candidates like find their way to a job that they absolutely love. And then likewise, for a hiring manager to be so incredibly happy about somebody who's joining their team, there's a lot of satisfaction that comes with that. And so I think for new recruiters sort of entering the field, whether it's agency side or internally on the talent acquisition side, I think they put so much pressure on themselves to just like fill the job, right? Mm-hmm. And they lose sight of the big picture. And if you don't have that feeling of satisfaction that comes when you've made a great placement and both the candidate and the hiring manager are happy about the match, it's less motivating. But once you experience that a few times, like you kind of catch the bug and you're excited to do it again and again and again. And you start to reflect on what was it about that experience that felt right, and how do you repeat that, candidate after candidate or search after search. So I can, I guess, empathize with new recruiters that they're like, why did I get into this? This is hard. Mm-hmm. I don't see what the joy is in doing this work.
I have a question for you. I don't know if we ever talked
Sure.
about this before, and everyone has a different story, but do you remember how long it took you to make your first placement on the agency side?
Oh, gosh, I don't know it doesn't stand out to me like it was really like a long time. I think it was just, I remember like how exciting it was to be like, okay, I can do this, right? That it was a really difficult search. And so like that added satisfaction around like, not only did I have my first placement, but it was like a really difficult position and for a customer that we were, trying to win over.
Do you remember what, you don't have to say the candidate's name, but do you remember what the position was and who the candidate was?
Yeah, it was. It was an analytical chemistry position, and it was a much more senior level role than we had traditionally like worked on. So, to be able to network and to ultimately find this person. And I remember we had some. This really dates me, right? But we had some snafus with the candidate actually like finding the location in Cambridge. And at the time, we didn't have cell phones for the candidates to say, like, I'm lost, or we didn't have ways for them to be able to, like, find the location. So she had to keep going to, like, a payphone and calling me back, like, in the office to let me know, like, that she was on her way and she was running late. So there's a lot of stress related to the logistics of getting the candidate there for the interview.
That's wild. I mean, some of these things we take for granted now, like the
Yes.
Google Maps and the cell phones. And you're right, like it wasn't really that long ago where that stuff wasn't so accessible. And I think from a recruiter standpoint, that makes logistically our job so much easier that candidates have all these logistical resources at their fingertips. So it's kind of funny. I can't imagine the additional level of stress that occurred during those situations.
Yes, and now I think our challenge today, sort of post-pandemic, is oftentimes candidates are not going in for in-person interviews, which is a whole nother thing, right? Instead, we're talking about like navigating technology and snafus that come along with like the Zoom link didn't work or bad internet connection or whatever. It's just a totally different set of logistical challenges that come with like actually getting someone hired.
Yeah. So you actually bring up a good point, and I think we're gonna talk about this from a philosophical standpoint soon. But it actually leads us into an area that I think we want to talk about, and that is, what is your philosophy on in-person versus virtual interviews? Because you and I both know, and you and I both work together in an environment that meeting people face to face was the primary goal, whether it was a client or whether it was a candidate. And now, like you said, in the post-pandemic world, so much of the interview process is reliant upon Zoom meetings and Teams meetings and virtual meetings and phone calls. And so there's clearly benefits to that, and there's clearly things that are probably disadvantage to those two different philosophies or different methods of interviewing. But what is your take on in-person versus virtual interviewing, and what do you think some of the benefits are, and what do you think some of the downfalls are? Because I actually, it worries me as a continuing theme, but I'm curious to hear about your philosophy.
Right. Well, and as you were just describing this, I was reflecting back to the beginning of the pandemic, and I remember like sort of like that first week that it was like everybody's going to stay home, and like this is the plan, thinking that it would only last a couple weeks, right? Mm-hmm. And at the time, I remember the hiring managers that I was working with saying like, all right, well, let's just push off some of these interviews. We'll just delay them for a little bit. Thinking back now, can you imagine if we had delayed for 2 years, because nobody would have thought. But in the beginning, like that was sort of the initial reaction from hiring managers, like, well, we'll just push this off because I really want to meet with the candidate in person. And of course, we've all learned and had to adapt. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to make any hires. So I would say, and this could be generational, this could be more so just my own personal preferences. I do believe that an in-person interview at some stage in the process is critical. And so, as you mentioned, like there is a convenience, there is something to be said for being able to do virtual interviews. And I think that we're able to move much faster than having a candidate take a day off from work to go into a company to do a full day of interviews. I think you're able to spread sequence of interviews over days or weeks, do 1 hour here, 1 hour there, and you're able to do that from home or, from the office. But then when you get to those like final decisions, and I think that the relationship between the candidate and the hiring manager especially needs to happen in person. And again, this could just be my personal preference, but it's important just around like expectation setting. I think it's important around like alignment on like the role and how you work style, preferences. If that connection doesn't happen, I think you're in for trouble down the road.
Yeah. No, I think you bring up a good point about you take those two methodologies and you put them together, and maybe that's the best, because there is a lot more flexibility. And I've seen it on my end partnering with clients where they've taken a hybrid approach where, the first round of interviews is virtual, and then once it gets to the final stage, they'll fly the person in, or they'll make the person go to the site, and then they'll have a final stage interview. And you're right. I think as long as that happens at least once along the way, but then you can use the virtual piece from a flexibility standpoint up front. That probably is the best approach, and it saves a lot of logistical headaches as well.
Yeah, and if you bear with me for a second and use some like recruiter speak, right? Like when you think about the recruiting funnel or, the sales funnel, and you think about, at the top, you have lots and lots of applicants or leads or like potential candidates. And as you make your way through like an interview process, I mean, the goal is ultimately that you're narrowing down through interviews and skills assessments and like evaluation of like, does this person have the skill set or the capability to do this job? Once you get past that and like the interview team, like the hiring team feels like, okay, I could see this person in the job, then you're sort of evaluating like work style, preferences, leadership, more, some of the behaviors and I guess more personal skills, right? And I think that at that point, it almost transitions to setting the person up for success in the job. So at that point, like, hiring managers kind of made up their mind, like, okay, I could see this person doing the job. Now I need to evaluate like whether we're going to have a good working relationship or not. And it's actually like the start of onboarding to some degree, even though the candidate doesn't have the offer yet, even though they haven't said yes. It's really about like, can we work together? What's it going to be like to work together? And so that face-to-face time and like good quality time for the hiring manager and the candidate to spend at that stage, I think is important. And, I would say the same thing, not to go off on a tangent too much, but I would say the same thing when it comes to references. Like the approach I have always taken with conducting references is most often you're not going to not hire the person if you get to that stage and you're doing references. So use that time to get tips and tricks and best practices around really making the most out of this hire. Like, how do I get the most out of them? How do I get them engaged? Like, what's motivating to them? Like, what are things I shouldn't do with the candidate? So I would say like that late stage interview where you're spending that time in person is also part of that around, if I'm bringing you on, how do I set you up for success?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that leads me to another topic. And that's, I think as recruiters, especially as technical or scientific recruiters, we're really trained to focus on the technical aspects of this person's backgrounds. And I think it's easy, or it has been easy in the past, to lose sight of those cultural preferences for the candidate and cultural preferences for the hiring manager. And as I've grown up in my career, I've kind of realized, I think the cultural piece and the actual fit piece and the motivational piece of the hire is as important as the technical piece. I would say it's 50-50, but what's your take on that? How do you think, how important is the technical piece versus the actual personal fit?
Yeah, and I think you'd probably have to ask a technical manager that question, but I would say, and I just had some recent experiences with this, it's actually hard for technical managers to assess the technical skills, because when you get to asking them about the interview process and say like, okay, well, how are you going to evaluate X, Y, or Z skill? Like, how do you know if they're good at such and such when it comes to drug discovery, like picking targets or whatever, some sort of assay that they may be conducting. And they have a hard time. Like they, some of it is based on, just validation of the places they've been or what the candidate has seen. So it is really challenging, I think, for even a hiring manager to assess those skills without actually being in the job next to them and seeing their work over time. So I would say, like, once you can get past that initial screening, yes, then it becomes more so about the person's motivations and like why they do the work that they do and does that align with what the company is doing. So, I think for now, 50-50 is probably a good guess, but I think, you'd have to ask technical managers like what they think about that.
Yeah, recruiting in the sciences is certainly not an exact science.
And I would say, like, if, just thinking about like interviewing for recruiters, let's say, the technical aspects of recruiting, like if I'm evaluating a recruiter to join my team, I would say like the technical aspects of like how they source, how they find candidates, like that's probably less important because honestly, like I would prefer to teach and align around like our approach. So again, I'm not a scientist, but I would say like the technical skill of recruiting is probably maybe even like 40% of it, and then 60% of it is really more so around like philosophy and like how you approach partnering and doing your job, like if I were evaluating people to join my team.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so I know we've actually been talking about this, but that leads me to my next question, which is, when it comes to you and your best practices and some of your philosophies when it comes to hiring, and I know we just discussed a few of them, but what other best practices and philosophies do you take to heart when it comes to hiring?
Yeah, so I think at the core, it's important, and some of this sounds obvious, so, pardon me on that, but it's a two-way street, right? I think it's important for the company, the hiring manager, the team to evaluate a candidate to make a decision whether they're going to be right for the job or not. But it's also the candidate is evaluating the company, the hiring manager, the team, and whether it's a fit for them, which is what we just talked about. Yeah. And constantly reminding everybody who's involved in the hiring experience, as I would say, is important because oftentimes, if you ask people who've been through interview processes and like their best experience and their worst experience, like the worst experience is when candidates feel like they're grilled and it's like question, right? And they feel like they're not qualified or whatever, they're being grilled. Like that doesn't feel good. So how do you make it more of a conversation where it's like, hey, we're both going to talk about this opportunity and mutually we're going to decide if this is a fit or not. And I think it lets candidates, like they let their guard down, like they're like, finally somebody understands. And that's often the first conversation that I have with a candidate is to say like, hey, this is, me, this is what my job is. I work in our talent acquisition team. And my job here is to make sure that you get all the information you need to make an informed decision about whether this is the right fit for you. And likewise, that our team has all the right information they need. So as we go through this process, we'll be asking you questions. You'll have a chance to get to know the team. But if you feel like you need additional time with the person or you feel like you need access to a certain role because it interfaces with your position, let me know and I will facilitate that. And I think it just, from the get-go, it just has a very different vibe for everybody involved. So I think that, that's at the core. I don't know if you have any questions or we want to talk more about that, but I can keep going when it comes to, best practices and philosophies.
Yeah, so, you mentioned something that I've noticed in my time, and I think it's been a conscious shift, and that is really the evolution from candidates getting grilled during an interview process to actually wanting to give the candidate a good experience during their interview process, even if they're not the best fit. And I don't think that 15, 20 years ago when I started, that was really taken to consideration. I think it was, we're going to grill this candidate, we're going to make sure they have X, Y, Z. as a hiring manager, we have most of the power, and if we don't get back to the can afterwards, well, we're just too busy. But now I do feel there's been a shift, and I feel that you have actually probably been one of the pioneers in that shift to take a candidate from being grilled, for lack of a better term, to actually having a good experience. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and some of your experiences in that, implementing that process?
Well, I appreciate being called a pioneer, Chris.
Well, you are, Wendy. You are.
So, I think some of that is market dynamics, of course, right? Like it's, become more of a candidate's market. And I think there's a limited number of people who have qualifications for some of the jobs that, we're trying to fill. But I think now companies, hiring managers, like HR teams for sure, understand like the value of not just like, yes, like we got the hire, right? Like then the person walks in the door is like, okay, now the real work starts to onboard the person, to get them to the point where they can come up to speed and become productive in their job. And so if you do more of that work up front in an interview process, it's actually going to make for a much more successful hire. And, there's all kinds of like statistics and data around like the cost of a bad hire. And I think like, yes, you can talk in dollars and cents around that cost, but I think that so many people now, whether as a hire themselves, as a new employee in an organization, or as a hiring manager who's bringing people into their teams, they have a greater appreciation for making sure that everything is the right fit, the candidate has a good experience, having a transparent conversation about what the job is and what it isn't, and that there's value in doing that rather than getting the wrong person on the team. It's just like, then it's not good for everybody. Like you've wasted time in the interview process, your team's wasted time on training the person, and it's just not a good fit all around. So I think through experiences, people now see like, I'd rather spend more time up front and make sure this is right.
Yeah. Would you say that what you just described is one of the key differences between talent acquisition and recruiting?
I think it's part of it, right? Like I think oftentimes I'll say recruiting is part of talent acquisition, right? And like when I think of recruiting, I think of the core hunt, right? Like how do you generate the list of names and the people that you actually want to reach out to who might fit your job, right? It's the top of the funnel, so to speak, is recruiting, engaging people, getting them excited about your company. But I would say on the talent acquisition side, also part of it is like the longer view and like sort of like the long range like talent strategies that you're pipelining. You're not constantly in a reactive mode to like, oh, somebody quit, now we need to hire someone. Like if you're just starting that engine, it takes longer. So like how do you pipeline? How do you think about a long range view of maybe say like a 3-year plan of like what are the capabilities we're going to need inside this organization 2 years from now when we finish this clinical study, or we move to commercial, or we're going to need a regulatory function. Like thinking more strategically about your workforce plan would be part of talent acquisition. Also branding, hiring experience, like how you design your interview process, compensation, benefits, all of those things are part of like your talent acquisition strategy.
Yeah. So you mentioned something that I think has come up lately from the corporate side, and that is building a pipeline of viable candidates. And, I've always looked at that as more of an agency tactic. However, I see and I hear about a lot of biotech companies taking a pipeline approach to their recruiting strategy or their talent acquisition strategy. I guess maybe you can talk to me a little bit about some specific pipelining strategies or tactics that you've put into place and kind of how that works from an individual company or from a corporate TA standpoint.
And I think this is company specific, but I would say it's more so around like what are your core skill sets that you feel you're always going to need, right? Like this sort of ongoing, one of the terms that recruiters in talent acquisition use is evergreen positions, like just the ongoing constant need for certain positions. those are certainly skill sets that you should be pipelining for, and thinking about, okay, not just how do I get them and take talent from other companies, but how do I grow them myself? So a lot of times, like, part of pipelining is university relations, it's campus recruiting, it's internships, and it's sort of like developing the next generation of talent in a particular skill set, especially if it's hard to find or there are very few people that have those skills. That's one philosophy when it comes to pipelining. And then also just what I've tried to do in places I've been is just teaching hiring managers, leaders, anybody in the organization that you should constantly be recruiting and networking. And some people are just better networkers. I think that they enjoy staying in touch with people and, their previous companies and so forth. But if you're doing that on a regular basis, then when you have a position come up, then you're not starting from scratch. And so just kind of ingraining that philosophy, that approach for people in their day-to-day work is part of the pipelining strategy for a company.
Interesting. So would you or have you gone as far to engage with candidates on a proactive basis at the corporate level, or is it more so kind of a broader big picture networking, building relationships with certain organizations or universities? Tell me about, I'm curious about that.
About the approach, or how you would?
Yeah, I guess if you're trying to quote unquote build a pipeline for your company, would you have the TA team or the recruiters in your team go as far to proactively engage a candidate because they have a particular skill set, or is it more so, okay, let's take a broader macro approach to this and, like you said, focus on relationships with universities or internships or employee branding or employer branding rather? Is it more broad, or is it would you go as granular as to actually proactively engage with a candidate that you weren't looking to hire? Just curious.
Yeah, and I would say it's probably all of the things that you just mentioned. And I would say from a proactive standpoint, I think oftentimes, I have what I would call exploratory or networking conversations, and I encourage teams to do the same. You'll often see on companies' websites that will, on their careers page, it'll say if you don't see a position that suits your background, but you're interested generally speaking in the company, please apply here, please submit your resume here. And there's all kinds of things that you can do with technology and tools to continue to engage candidates. So, for example, somebody self-selects into I'm interested, I'm following your company. You can proactively send out press releases, or you can send out interesting data that just came out, just to continue to just have touch points with people who've raised their hand and said that they're interested in your company. Another approach when it comes to using technology is looking at LinkedIn and looking at all the people that follow you. Those are, what I would call warm leads. They're people who, for whatever reason, are saying I'm interested in continuing to see what's going on with your company. Those are great people to engage, even if it's on a proactive basis, to say hey, when you're ready to make a move, we'll still be here and we'll be looking for people like you. So let's stay in touch. Although now isn't the right time, let's stay in touch. And figuring out a way, Chris, this, on the agency side, this was, what we would do constantly is just check in once a month or every 3 months or whatever the cadence is to stay connected to people. The other thing that I've done, and it was successful, it's been a couple of years, but you can, as a company, just host science days where you invite people in the community to just come in and see what you're up to, things that you can share in a non-confidential way, just around what are you doing when it comes to your science or your lead programs, and people will come to those, or employees in the company will invite people that they've worked with, or they were students together, they'll send that out to their network and say, hey, come check out what me and my company have been doing. Over time, when the person is ready to make a move, they already know a little bit about your company, they've engaged, they've met some people, they've come to events before. And so most people, I think, these days are always thinking about I'm here in this job, and my next move is going to be X or Y. And so to be part of that process and having those connections, I think, makes it easier when it comes time to hire.
Yeah, no, that's really, really good insight. I appreciate that, and I'm actually learning a ton right now. So, all right, so you get to a point where you've built up this pipeline, and you have hosted these events, and you've built these relationships, and then you're not getting the candidate you need, or maybe you have a very special hire. And so this really leads me to my next topic, is partnering with agencies. And so you've obviously worked with an agency for a large portion of your career, and then you've worked on the other side where you've had to partner with agencies for a large portion of your career. So from your standpoint, Wendy, what are some best practices for agencies to partner with clients? And then what are some best practices for talent acquisition leaders like yourself to partner with agencies?
The key there, Chris, is the word you use, partner, right? I think about the times where, when I was on the agency side and I had sort of my best customers, some of my customers, I knew better some of my team internally, because I spent so much time with them and I cared deeply about their success. So I took the time to understand, what was going on with their programs, and what were some of the important hires for them. And so it's managing that relationship and truly being a partner, and not just about what's the next position I can fill and what's the next search fee I can make. Yeah. It's really that you have a long view of being a strategic partner to that customer. And then I would say, on the talent acquisition side, what I've always appreciated is agencies who operate that way. They're checking in with me periodically, hey, do you have any searches for me to work on? What's going on? And we're maintaining a dialogue, so that then when the time comes and I have a position that I need help with, that I can pick up the phone and they're up to speed on what's been going on with the company and working with me, so that it becomes easy. And they're also providing perspective. So I would say, if you're on the agency side, being an advisor and truly a partner, and not just about that transactional experience. So what are the market trends? What are some perspectives that you can offer? What opinions do you have? Just somebody gives you a search, you're not an order taker and you're jotting down notes about what's the position, what are the qualifications that you're looking for. You may have an opinion to say oh gosh, I think they're looking to hire somebody too senior and they're not going to be interested. Share that with them, but do it in a way that you're offering your perspective. At the end of the day, you're going to deliver for your customer, but if you can offer insights and perspective, I think that your clients will appreciate it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one thing that I think I've kind of learned over the years, is the client actually wants to hear your perspective on the candidate, and they want an honest assessment, right? They don't want to be necessarily sold to, right? And I think as a hiring manager or as a TA lead, you can probably tell if you're being sold to or if you're being consulted with, right?
Exactly. And you can tell the ones when people are motivated by commissions or by sales and that sort of thing. And I get it, it's your livelihood. But I think that if you take a step back and you also are considering your reputation as a partner, you'll get repeat business over and over. And in fact, those clients are going to be the ones that refer other people to you. So thinking about my agency career, I think early on, you're just struggling to survive and you need the next search. But when I think about when I enjoyed my job the most, when I felt like I was performing at my peak, it was that I had a set group of customers that I really enjoyed partnering with. I loved when they called me to work on a search, because I knew that I would have that mutual respect. And they were the ones that helped me build my book of business, because they were referring me to their colleagues. And eventually then, business is coming and you're not so worried about when's the next transaction that you're going to have, and more so that you have this reputation as a trusted advisor and talent partner in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is really, I think you and I have spoke about this for years, but this is all, we share the same exact philosophy. So I can appreciate you saying it out loud and validating that. Okay. From the corporate side, right? Mm-hmm. How would you say, how would you say you evaluate, and I think you maybe talked about this a little bit, but how would you say you evaluate agencies? Is it the ones that are just constantly checking in with you? Do you like people who are niche focused? Do you like people who are broadly focused? Do you want to narrow it down to keep it to like just 2 or 3 different agencies to simplify your life? I guess what has been an agency strategy for you at the organizations you've worked at from the corporate side?
And this may not be as helpful to agencies because I think it depends, right? Like I think it depends on the search, and I would say in my overall, agency search partner strategy, it's situation dependent. So in some cases, generally speaking, I think my preference is to lean toward like more of like a boutique search firm because I think that you get more attention, like you're getting like that sort of partnership because they have the time to spend in getting to know the company and really taking a more customized approach to how they do a search. And I would say, sometimes at the more senior levels, like at the executive level and in routine search, sometimes you have to go with the bigger firms because they have a reputation with the candidate pool that you're targeting. So I think it just depends on what's the goal, what's the search, and who's the best agency partner in that particular category.
Makes total sense. Very logical. All right. We've covered a lot, and so in a relatively short amount of time, efficient as always, Wendy. But here's how I want to close this out is what type of advice would you give to someone who has just entered the recruiting space or who has just entered the TA space, whether that's professional advice or life advice? Or what kind of advice would you give someone who just entered the space?
I would say shadow people. I think that there's no, kind of going back to our conversation about like in this remote working world, I actually feel, and I was talking to someone about this recently, how do new recruiters train if they've never done recruiting before? Like, how do they train in a remote environment? It's actually probably pretty challenging because I think the nuances in how an experienced and successful recruiter does their job are really in just the way that they build relationships, the way that they connect with clients and candidates, and that's really specific to you as a person, right? Like, you have to be who you are, and if you're trying to be somebody else and trying to take an approach that just doesn't feel authentic for you, it's never going to work, and candidates and clients are going to see right through it. So by watching, by observing, and seeing how successful recruiter navigates a conversation, you'll learn what's going to work for you. The other thing, and I cringe thinking about it because nobody likes to hear themselves, but if you can record yourself or you can, have somebody listen in on your conversations and give feedback, it's the way that you'll get better. And I'm laughing because, Chris, you know this firsthand. I think the idea of like role playing and having people listen, it's just like, so painful.
Yeah.
But I think that you learn a lot and things that you don't realize that you do until you see yourself on video or recorded.
I totally agree with that. It's a cringy but highly effective strategy to learn. And I think back of all the role plays I did, actually probably with you and with other leaders in my office at the time. I don't know if you remember this, but one of the companies that you and I worked at together, during a training procedure they'd actually have a video recording of you conducting a candidate or a client meeting, and you'd have to watch that video. And so as difficult as those situations can be, you're right, they're extremely effective, and that real feedback, while it might feel odd or awkward in the moment, really can take you to a whole other level and really clean up some of the things that you are or aren't doing.
And the last thing I'll say on that, and this is probably advice for people in talent acquisition as well, is thinking about the long term. What do you want your reputation to be, right? Like, and if you could do this exercise and go around and talk to people about some of like the best recruiters and talent acquisition partners in this market, like what are some of the things that they say? Like what are some of the themes that you hear? Keeping that in mind as you're doing your job every day, every year that you're doing it, like just what is your reputation? And, I think the rest will follow. So I always try to take an approach where if I have a conversation with a candidate and we mutually agree that it's not a fit in, the current search that I'm working on, or I always try to be a resource to them and ask if I can make introductions for them, or I might even have suggestions for them, like, hey, have you checked out this company? You should go check them out. Like, I truly want to be a resource for them because at some point it will all come back tenfold. So it's the long view and maybe the benefit of many years of experience, but I would encourage even new recruiters to just think about, like, what's their reputation in the market, because that will be their ticket to success.
And that, Wendy, is why you are the ultimate people connector.
I knew it was going to come up at some point. I can't shake it now. It was something that I came up with when I was doing some branding work, and now I feel like I can't lose it because that's how I'm known. So I will continue to be the ultimate people connector.
You are, and there's no doubt about it. And it's, when I first saw that or heard that, I was like, that, I didn't even flinch. I was like, that's it. That's what she is. So just explained how and why you are, and it makes total sense. I really appreciate this. We covered a lot of really good topics, and your insight's been incredible, and we'll do it again. That's really it for today's recording. So thank you so much, Wendy.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Talent Therapy Podcast with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes only and is copywritten by Ronan Vance, LLC.